Transcending. Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can admit. Yeah, yes, I started YouTube already.
I will see Swamiji's image there and I will start.
Yeah, Swamiji image. Oh, you are not seeing? He's there. Okay, 1 minute.
Not on YouTube. Not on YouTube.
Oh, YouTube. You will see. Okay. Okay, you can see now.
Me not yet. Okay, Maharaj. I will admit everybody.
Yeah.
Give me 1 minute. Yes, Maharaj. We can start.
We can start. Okay. Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmaswarupine avatara varisthaya ramakrishnaya te namaha yonta pravishya mama vachamimam prasuptam sanjeevayadi akhila shakti dharaswadhamna anyamscha hastacharana-sravanatvagadin pranan namo bhagavate purushaya tubhyam. We are continuing our discussion on the episodes of the Bhagavata Purana. Today I am going to discuss one of the most philosophical episodes found in this text. It is called Nimi-nava-yogi-sambada. It appears on the 11th skandha, the Ekadasha skandha. It is deeply philosophical, spiritual, with a strong devotional orientation. It also begins with a story. A number of saints and sages are visiting a king with the name Nimi. So Nimi was the name of a well-known king of those days. He was himself a great spiritual seeker and as a philosopher and well-known. In those days, there was a tradition that from time to time, great saints and sages used to visit the kings and emperors in their courts. And there will be an assembly of scholars and philosophers, saints, and also kings and those who were interested in philosophy, in spiritual ideas. There will be long discussions. You find references to such discussions throughout the Vedic literature, especially in the two Upanishads of Chandogya and Brihadaranyaka. In other Upanishads also you find. But this unique phenomenon in a way contributed to the enhancement and preservation of this Vedic spiritual tradition. They could exchange ideas. Whenever these saints visited the kings in their courts, the king will put them some questions. One of the most profound discussions in the entire Upanishadic literature is a discussion between Janaka, a king, and Yajnavalkya. And another one, a dialogue between Yajnavalkya and a famous philosopher saint who was a lady saint with the name Gargi. So you find such episodes. So that's what we are going to discuss today. So 9 sages together are paying a visit to a king. The king's name is Nimi. So the name is given Kavir Hari Randariksha Prabudha Pipalayanaha Avi Hotrota Dumilas Chamasat Karabhajanaha. It's very interesting. The list of these 9 sages is given here. Kavihi, Harihi, Andariksha, Prabudha, Pipalayana, then Avir Hotra, Drumila, Chamasa, Karabhajanaha. These are the 9 sages. Now what happens later is very interesting. The king puts one question to each of these 9 sages. What are the topics discussed? How to live an ethical, moral, spiritual life in this world. how to conduct your everyday activities with some spiritual values along with your everyday obligations and duties. I mean, how to practice spiritual values in the context of your everyday activities, and how to cross the ocean of samsara, how to confront the problem of Maya, and how to cultivate devotion, how to pray to God. All these very interesting discussions are made. Very scholarly, very objective discussions. So, in this particular context, in the second adhyaya, second chapter of Ekadasha Skandha, 11th Skandha, 11th book, one question that the king puts to the whole group is, the question is put to the whole group of saints. Essential characteristics of Bhagavata Dharma. Now, one of the contributions of Bhagavata as a classic is the detailed exposition of what is called Bhagavata Dharma. It is different from other dharmas. Actually, it includes Karma Yoga, Bhakti, Jnanam, everything. What are the core values that every person should practice in his or her life, along with his or her daily obligations? Because as I mentioned yesterday, if you become very proud, well, I am doing my duty, I shall do my best, so I won't care for any values of God or anything, I shall do my duty. It is good to do your duty, it is important, it is very, very relevant, and it is unavoidable. But remember, people who are obsessed with duty alone are not necessarily very happy or contented. You may get a satisfaction of having done your duty, but the duty may not necessarily produce a spiritual feeling of inner bliss. For that you need something more to be added to duty consciousness. So you have to practice certain other values which helps you to do your duty properly, in fact more efficiently, but at the same time also presents before you a higher vision of life, a higher transcendental value that is worth living for. So this value that's worth living for, that in a way constitutes Bhagavata Dharma. It includes, devotion, Karma Yoga ideal, ethics, morality, Dhanam, Satyam, Shaucha, all Tapa, all these are included. So the question is, Ada Bhagavatam Bruda Yad Dharmo Yadrisho Dranam Yatha Acharadi Yad Brude Yai Bhagavat Priya. This is the question that the king puts to this group of saints. The question is, what are the indications, the external signs of an ideal devotee of God who is practicing this Bhagavata Dharma? What is his character, what is his quality, how do we identify him? Let's say, Ada Bhagavatam Bruda Yad Dharmo Yadrisho Nranam Yatha Acharadi Yad Brute Yailingaihi Bhagavat Priya. What are the indications by which you will be able to describe an ideal devotee? An ideal devotee, when you go deeper into the discussions here, which I don't have time for because we have just one more session, it actually presents before you an ideal human being. Never ever imagine that by Bhagavata Dharma we mean some kind of going to a temple or a place of worship and do some mechanical rituals and forget everything, and then forget everything about spirituality and then carry on your own real life in a different way. That is not at all. In fact, that is actually indicated here as the kindergarten in the beginning of spiritual life. So, in answer to this question, the question is in simple. Who is Bhagavata? Who is the highest devotee? And remember, here devotion doesn't mean necessarily worshipping God alone. No. It doesn't mean reading a holy book in a very ceremonial, in a very ritualistic manner every day, and then living our life differently after that. Not at all. How to implement and actually practice and bring into our every micro moment, every activity, the spiritual values that we are trying to practice. In answer to this, Hari, so Kavir Hari Antariksha, the second of the Nava-yogis, is giving the answer. So Hari Ruvacha. Sarva bhudeshu ye pasyet bhagavad bhavam atmanaha bhudani bhagavadi atmani esha bhagavatottamaha. I think this comes 45th verse of the second chapter of the 11th skandha, 11th book, Ekadasha skandha. So who is Bhagavatottama? Bhagavatanam uttama means the highest, the noblest devotee of God. Sarva bhudeshu ye pasye. The one who sees the presence of God in everything and everyone and everything in God. So a kind of identity, a kind of spiritual kinship with the whole existence, with the whole humanity, not only human beings but even animal kingdom. Because in everything, in everyone, there is a divine spark, the presence of God. For that reason, humanity is one. There is no otherness, a kind of highly evolved spiritual humanism, universal spiritual humanism. That's what you find here. So the highest devotee of God is not necessarily a person who goes to a place of worship every day without failure. No. He may go, of course, no doubts. He may go to temples, churches, places of worship. He may meditate on God. He may even perform rituals as normally they do. But their religion, their spirituality doesn't stop there. It extends to a higher spiritual paradigm, which is a universal spiritual humanism. So, Sarva bhudeshu yapasye, yaha sarva bhudeshu pasyet means the one, Bhagavad Bhavam, the one who experiences the presence of the divine in everyone, in everything that is created. That's meaning of Bhudam. And the one who sees everyone and everything as present in the divine. So that is the most essential characteristic of a spiritual devotee, of a highly evolved person. So now remember, this is the, let us say, the highest reach of spiritual evolution. This is not where we begin, but this is the goal that we must strive to achieve. One may ask this question: what's the use of presenting this very high ideal before us? Because this is certainly a distant goal, not easy to practice, not easy even to attain. So Shankaracharya in his Gita Bhashya gives a clue as to why in spiritual literature frequently we find a list of the characteristics of the highest spiritual person. Not that we should assume that we have reached that stage, or rather that we should assume that we have actually, we are expected to practice that instantly. Not at all. So Bhashyakara says, Shankaracharya says in the Gita Bhashya, Sarvatra hi adhyatma shastre kudartha lakshanani yani tani eva sadhanani vadishyande yatna sadhyatva. All these great characteristics are mentioned, which can be practiced and attained by us by our effort. So these constitute the goals for us to reach, not actual reality. So all these lakshanas are given, all these indications or characteristics of the most highly evolved spiritual person. The list is given and it is enumerated and explained, elaborately described in the spiritual literature. This is applicable. This is applicable to all spiritual literature, the whole range of spiritual literature, everywhere. For the beginners or those who are still evolving, to aim at, to consider as the goal to be reached. Yani yatna sadhyani sadhanani lakshanani cha bhavanditani. So, for those who are still practicing spiritual disciplines, those who are still evolving, it is something to be attained. So, if you are a kindergarten boy going to a kindergarten or maybe primary school, studying physics, and then you read the life and maybe about the achievements of Albert Einstein, we may age, this is what I should try to be like. Let me just giving a rough parallel example. You aim at the superlative level of spiritual evolution, spiritual attainment, so that it will inspire you. That's why that description is given here. I mean, the highest devotee is one who can see God everywhere, who can see everything in God, who can practice spirituality and presence of God not only within the place of worship, but can practice it even outside the place of worship, not while reading a holy book, but even outside the realm of holy literature, you will be able to really feel the presence of God. In order to achieve this, we may have to work hard. That is the next description. You find in the next verse, there is something much more interesting, much more practical. Everything is okay? You find in the next verse, the 46th verse, here the great sage Hari, he is trying to explain what should be the path, the method for those who are still evolving, those who are still practicing spiritual disciplines. They should be careful. They should not imagine that they have reached the goal. So he says, Ishware tat adhineshu baliseshu dusutsucha prema maitri kripa upeksha yat karodi samadhyamaka. So, in the earlier verse, in the 45th verse, what we described is a list of the characteristics of the most highly evolved spiritual person. But suppose you are still going to the primary school, let us say, not the university, but primary school of spiritual life. Then you have to be careful, you should be attentive, you should focus on your studies, and you should also practice certain disciplines so that your time and energy won't be wasted. So at that time, you should be careful. If you have become a Buddha, you can convert an Angulimala. And Angulimala was a robber whose main hobby was cutting off the fingers of innocent travelers and making garlands of it and wearing it. And Buddha managed to transform him into a saint, and Angulimala became a saint. But you should not try to assume that you have become a Buddha and go out trying to transform and convert Angulimala. Rather, you will be converted. You should be very careful. We should not assume that we have reached the goal. So what we should do? We should be very careful. So, in our everyday conversations and interactions with people around, we should practice certain disciplines, certain methods. We should be friendly and try to associate with spiritual seekers like ourselves. And we should be compassionate, sympathetic towards those who are even less advanced than us. And we should congratulate, we should appreciate, we should admire those who are more advanced than us. And we should, much more importantly, we should keep a long distance from those whose association can shake your own convictions, can distract you from your own path, from your own goal. That is something very important. That's why prema, maitri, kripa, upeksha, yak karodi, samadhyamaka. So these are the four attitudes and approaches that we should assume while interacting with people around. In fact, Patanjali Yoga Sutra also recommends a similar discipline for those who are practicing yoga discipline. If you are looking for chitta prasada, you should also practice certain disciplines. So, friendship and close association with other devotees, because the best way for us to advance in spiritual life is to seek the company of other spiritual seekers. And the worst way you can distract yourself is to associate with the wrong type of people whose words and associations can pour cold water on your own faith. So that could happen, especially for the beginner. If you are still going to kindergarten, a little innocent child, another student, maybe somebody may, education. It's very dangerous actually. You will end up being an illiterate dump. So you should be very careful. Rather, you should associate with people who may tell you, well, you should work hard, you should study better, you should try to get a high grade. That's the kind of people that a student studying in primary school should be encouraged to associate with. Not with those who don't believe in education. Similarly, upeksha is an important, it is a spiritual mechanism that helps you to filter out wrong samskaras, wrong impressions, wrong influences. Because we should remember, everyone in this world may not be spiritually inclined. But wrong association can take you off your own path and can bring spiritual disaster to your life. In fact, this idea is not limited to Vedanta. When you are still following the spiritual path, along with this own spiritual mechanism that helps you to associate with other spiritual seekers, have sympathy for other spiritual seekers, and then to, as far as possible, not physically but mentally, in terms of ideas, keep yourself outside of the influence of the wrong association, the people who may distract you from your path. These ideas are found in other world literature. So, in fact, according to Narada Bhakti Sutra, Shandilya Bhakti Sutra, and of course even according to the ideas presented in the writings of Saint Teresa of Avila, in the Inner Castle, you find the role of harmony of God's grace and our own effort. That's very important. So you should please remember, what I first mentioned in the 45th verse was the state of highest devotee. In the 45th verse. In the 46th verse, here the sage is describing the position of those who have not reached that high stage, who are still going to kindergarten, going to primary school. Let us say what they should do. In spiritual life, they should practice a kind of synthesis of their effort and also God's grace. God's grace as an important, it's a great significance in spiritual life. But so also our own effort. Because our efforts, our striving, our austerities or prayer, meditation, all these disciplines make us grace worthy. Then only we will be able to make proper use of God's grace. Unless we are fit for God's grace, we won't be able to recognize God's grace as God's grace. We may interpret it as accident. So everything, according to the modern schools of agnostics and atheists, all these are accidents. So that means just something that you don't go for an explanation. But in spiritual life, these two apparently opposing, conflicting phenomena, they are not really mutually contradictory. They are interrelated and they are integrated together. One is God's grace and our effort. So in the centuries of Bible, as you find a story, for example, a farmer trying to irrigate his field has to work hard. He has to bring water from a river, from a pond, from a well, and he has to cut a canal and bring the water from maybe nearby river and connect the field that he wants to irrigate with the river. Then water flows down. And for that he needs to do hard work, removing the soil and cutting the canal. That's not enough. He should also remove the weeds and grass and stones and pebbles that is scattered in the field. Then only the irrigation will be productive, will be useful. Otherwise weeds will grow. You work hard and irrigate the field and weeds will grow, grass will grow. So before that we should remove all the weeds and grass and pebbles and stones from the field and make it ready for irrigation. That hard work involved in making the field ready for irrigation corresponds to human effort. It's called in Sanskrit Purusha Prayatna, means one's own striving or effort, prayer, meditation and so on. But that's not enough. You also need to pray, because the effect, bhakti or devotion is not the necessary, it's not a product of our effort. There is an unknown factor that is not within our comprehension, and that's called kripa in Sanskrit, Ishvara kripa. So these two have equal place in spiritual life. Sri Ramakrishna says, there are very wonderful parables in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. See, God may give you everything, but you should be able to handle it. There is an interesting incident in one of Sri Ramakrishna's own most prominent disciples, Swami Brahmanandaji. He was a highly evolved person, exalted spiritual person, but he was always practicing spiritual disciplines. So somebody asked him, "You are such an exalted person. Now why do you, Sri Ramakrishna has given you everything?" He says, "He has given me, but what he has given me, I should make my own." So what you earn is yours, not necessarily what you are given. We make what we are given to us ours only by making our own effort, by making ourselves fit for it. So that's the importance of God's grace and human effort. And you find in the Bhagavata there are some very striking statements which goes far beyond anything that you normally study under the title religion. See, aham sarveshu bhudeshu bhudatmanam kridalayam arche danamanabhyam maitriya abhinena chakshusha. Lord Krishna says, I have made my home in the hearts of devotees, human beings or living beings. And you should respect, honor and serve those human beings around you. If you want to serve me, it's not enough just to do ceremonies within the marble structure. You should also extend your devotion beyond the marble structure by seeing the presence of God living in the hearts of all human beings or fellow human beings. So of course there are innumerable such statements all over Bhagavata which are very humanistic. Aham sarveshu bhudeshu bhudatma avasthita sada tam avajnaya mam martya kuride archa vidambanam. So again find the compassion, humanism and so on. These are the characteristics of devotees who reach the highest stage. See, aham sarveshu bhudeshu bhudatma avasthita sada tam avajnaya mam martya. I am present in all living beings. You ignore my presence in other living beings and you limit your worship of me to the temple, to the rituals. That I don't accept. Aham uchavajay drivye kriyate kriyotpannana anaki naiva tushe archidotcha bhudagrama avamanina means those who ignore or insult, those who don't care, Bhudagrama, I mean the congregation of created beings, that's the meaning of Bhudagrama. Those who completely ignore the humanistic aspect of life and values and just practice mechanical rituals in the name of religion, it's called Archa Vidambanam, not real worship. It becomes a fallacy of religion. What happens? I won't be happy, naiva tushe, I won't be happy. So you find very powerful, very humanistic and very strong statements in the Bhagavata Purana. We should not dismiss Bhagavata as something where God asks you to go to temple and put flowers and worship and pray and obeisance, surrender yourself. No, that's not Bhagavata Purana. Bhagavata tells us about the highest philosophy of life, the highest humanism and the highest spirituality. After that you find the sage Hari is explaining. Again he is using strong language where he explains there are people, he doesn't condemn them, but they are just beginners in spiritual life. Archayam eva haraye pujam sasabdaye hade najatad bhakteshu chanyeshu sabhakta pragutasmadaha. What is the most primitive type of devotion? That is explained here. What is the most primitive? The highest, the most sublime type of devotion or spirituality is seeing God in everything and seeing everything and everyone in God. That's the highest. Those who have not yet reached that state, they should practice their disciplines and also they should make themselves grace-worthy. They should become ready for God's grace. So a combination, a synthesis of our effort and God's grace. And they should also practice a discerning mind in their everyday life and activities and associations. Then Hari, the great sage, is focusing on another aspect of spiritual evolution, spiritual life. That is, there is some kind of a devotion or religious practice where you limit your religious life or religious disciplines to certain external mechanical rituals without even understanding the meaning or the significance of what you are doing. Now remember, there are certain disciplines which have got an effect. You can find in the story of Ajamila Ubakhyana, you can find this, where if you chant the name of God even by accident, it can bring about an effect, a spiritual transformation, a spiritual benefit to you. Just like you take medicine without knowing it's medicine, it can cure you of your diseases. So such examples are there. But that is only for those who have a strong spiritual background, where they can easily identify themselves with their previous disciplines, with the previous spiritual samskaras, and then they will be able to do that practice with intensity and it will produce an effect. But for a beginner, there is always a risk to stop religion at the doorstep of external ceremonies. And here is a strong warning against that. It is good, it is necessary, it is important to go to kindergarten. But it is wrong to interpret going to kindergarten as the highest goal of education. You have to go beyond that. If you are going to kindergarten, study well. If you go to primary school, you should study well. Because that concentrated study will one day take you beyond kindergarten and beyond primary school and take you all the way to university and even beyond. So, but it is wrong to assume that education stops at the kindergarten or primary school. Now, this really happens unconsciously without our being aware of it in our religious life. So, people archayam eva hare pujam saddhaye kati. They practice archayam eva, means only in the external images. Saddhaya hare pujam ikate. So, this in a broader sense could mean giving too much importance or giving importance only to the external aspect of the ceremonies and rituals. Rituals and ceremonies do have an importance. They play a very important role. In fact, without rituals and ceremonies, religious tradition would not have survived, could not have been preserved. So that's a very important principle agreed upon by all historians of religious philosophy, no doubt about it. But it is terribly wrong and it actually defeats the very purpose if you ever stop your religious life with the externals. The reason why it is focused here is very often this happens in our life. That's why it is important that Hari reminds King Nimi about this danger. And it's na tad bhakteshu cha anyeshu. So you do your rituals and ceremonies with great attention. And you completely ignore the human beings. And the humanistic aspect is completely the purpose of ceremonies, the ideas behind are completely ignored. Instead, what happens? It becomes a ritual. Actually, the purpose of external worship is to imagine that the spiritual energy that is omnipresent, that is all-pervading, that is present everywhere, is now focused on the external rituals, performances, and eventually you should be able to transcend that and try to identify yourself with the entire creation. So that's the purpose of all this. But frequently that is forgotten. So Hari says that is good, that is necessary, but that is prakrita. The prakrita bhakta means prakritehi prathama bhava, means the first evolute of nature, means it is just the beginning of spiritual life, kindergarten or primary school spiritual life. Now how to evolve? We all begin with external rituals, no doubt about it. We have to begin somewhere. Education normally begins at kindergarten or primary school. We can't begin education at university. So Bhagavata Purana itself has given many illustrations. In the Prahlada Upakhyana, which is one of the most prominent part of Bhagavata, says Prahlada, the great young devotee, teaches his friends Sravanam Kirtanam Vishnaho Smaranam Padasevanam Archanam Vandanam Dasim Sakhyam Atmanivedanam. So we can begin our spiritual life with the external. but we can progress stage by stage, one after another. We can evolve and ascend the steps of spiritual ladder. So he says, how to do that? Try to make proper use of all our faculties. So try to hear stories that will bring spiritual food to the mind. So hearing in the context of Bhagavata Purana, it means hearing the stories of Lord Krishna and chanting kirtanam, reciting holy words, the smaranam, remembering. You read a book, holy book, and then try to internalize, try to do mananam, try to do concentrate in thinking, because it is our concentrated thinking that helps us to go deeper into the meaning and significance of what we normally read and remember. And then perform rituals. That is also mentioned here, say Pada Sevanam, Archanam, worshipping, then doing Namaskara, Vandanam. These are all parts of rituals. Dasyam, looking upon yourself as a servant of God. Sakhyam, you can look upon yourself as a friend of God, or God as your friend, or God as your master, and self-surrender. Now, these are disciplines recommended to help a person to ascend the ladder of spiritual life. So one may begin with ceremonies and rituals. That's where we begin normally. But slowly, we can evolve, we can go further and further, and eventually reach a state where the whole world reminds you of the divine presence in it. That means world need not necessarily make you worldly minded. World can make you spiritual when we look upon the world and also think of the divine spark present everywhere. Then even the world itself becomes a reminder of not worldly matters but of the divine reality. And in this evolution, frequently we may have to face tests, trials and difficulties. There is one ancient sloka, Yasya anugraham ichchami tasya vittam haramyaham bandhavaischa viyogena prasham bhavati dukkhidaha tena dukkhena samtapto yadi mam na parityaje tam prasadam karishyami yad devairabi sudurlabham. The verse tells you that it is an allegory. You should not take it literally. God, it is as if Lord Krishna, God tells you, those whom I want to bless, I take away all his wealth. All his wealth is taken away from him because his wealth becomes an obstacle in his spiritual path. A person becoming too proud of his wealth needs his wealth to be taken away from him, and this happens only if God has a special grace for him. Now, we should not ever imagine that God is going to take your wealth away, not at all. What it means is, certain highly evolved spiritual persons who have a lot of samskaras suddenly may face a distraction, a dissipation, a deviation from his spiritual path. Then God puts some trials in front of him, which becomes a great help for him to make further ascent in his spiritual evolution. So he says, then bandhavaisha viyogena, and I will make him isolated from his own people. Still, if he doesn't forget me, and still if he remembers me, then I shall elevate him to such a high spiritual position that even gods will envy him. That's a literal meaning. What it means is, for a spiritual seeker, everything becomes an opportunity to make progress in spiritual life. Another interesting episode that perhaps is relevant in this context in the Bhagavata Purana. That is, there is a well-known story of Ajamila, which actually comes in the, I think, the sixth khanda it comes. Sorry, sixth skandha, sixth book. That's where the story of Ajamila comes. Sixth skandha. Now this is a very interesting story. Here is a story of a man who led a very pure life as a young man. He was trained properly as a God-fearing youth. He was taught devotional practices, spiritual disciplines, and he was an ideal son, an ideal member of the family, respected and liked by everyone. Such a person, by force of circumstances, fell prey to temptations, and he had a big fall in his life, a big deviation, and he became a drunkard, a cruel monster and a profligate who ill-treated his own wife and parents. His name is Ajamila. So you can see two phases, two stages in his life. Till he was a fairly grown-up young man, he grew up as a very pious, God-fearing person, living an ideal life, very obedient to his parents and very responsible, taking care of, very caring towards his wife and the other relatives. But then it so happened that unfortunately he fell into bad associations, and he became a drunkard, he became a profligate, he lost his spiritual path, he lost his spiritual culture, and that was a big fall for him. And then what happens? And he drove away his own parents from his home, and he deserted his wife. So terrible things he did. And afterwards, it was time for him to die. He became a very old man. In the process, he had his youngest son's name was Narayana. He had named his youngest son with the name Narayana, which actually becomes a synonym. It's a synonym of Lord Krishna, Vishnu. So this man became very old and he was about to die. So he was terrified because he knew he had done terrible things. Frequently people who were very proud of their agnostic or atheistic ideas. Well, I don't believe in God, I don't care for these things. They become extremely fearful and extremely shaken when they go for an operation, when they suddenly feel that there is always a danger of their leaving this world. It becomes a terrifying, very scary experience for them. So this frequently happens. Something like that happened to this man. And it was now time for him to die. So he was helpless and his mind was wandering, and in his total helplessness and pain that he was undergoing, he called out the name of his youngest son, and his name was Narayana, which is the synonym of Vishnu. And when he uttered this name, something else happened. Before that, before he uttered this name, the story goes like that: the servants of Yama, the Lord of Death, their terrifying demeanor, they approached him, and he was scared seeing them, the servants of messengers of death approaching him to take him away to hell. That was what he was terrified of. At that time, he called out the name of his youngest son, Narayana. Immediately, Vishnu's messengers came and rescued him. This is how the story goes. So, etavaneva lokesmin pumsam dharma parasmrta bhakti yogo bhagavati tannama grahanadibihi. That's how the dialogue ends in some context in that particular section. I mean, the highest, the most supreme dharma in modern times in Kali Yuga is the holy name of Lord Krishna. That itself can take you away, can rescue you from the tentacles of death. That's what it means. So the moment he uttered the name of Narayana, which happened to be the name of his own youngest son, Lord Narayana, Vishnu's messengers came and rescued him and gave him a longer life. We grant that you live longer, and now this time you should be a different person. You should go back to your old spiritual samskaras. You were a God-fearing person, then you had a big deviation and you fell into bad ways. You lost your track and you became an evil person. Now you know the consequences. So now we are giving you another chance and you should now become a different person. And Ajamila continued and lived for a few more years and went about going to holy places, spent all his remaining years in spiritual practices. So you can find many very interesting stories in the Bhagavata Purana. And it also gives some very striking graphic pictures of the highest devotee. So he is Smarantas Marayantascha Mithogu Bhagaram Harim Bhaktya Sanjadiya Bhaktya Bibhradi Ulpulagam. It means one important characteristic of a devotee of the most sublime type, that he will be always happy. It is called Sadhya Bhakti or Prema Bhakti, Supreme Bhakti. So when you reach the highest stage of your devotion, one important thing that happens to you is you become happy within and you become happy without. Nityotsavam bhavattesham nityasri nityamangalam. We find it in Bhagavata Purana itself, where every day, every moment, every occasion becomes an occasion for celebration, because you get immersed in the thought of God. And then there are very, very striking passages in the Bhagavata Purana. It's in the third adhyaya of Ekadasha Skandha. Kojit rudanti Achyuta chindaya kojit hasandi nandandi vadandi alaukikaha nrityandi gayandi anishilayanti ajam bhavandi tushnim parameti nirvrutaha. How a devotee who is immersed in thought of God, who is experiencing the presence of God every minute, everywhere, in every action, he becomes totally indifferent to worldly bondages, worldly pursuits. Sometimes kuchit rutanti, sometimes he cries and because he feels God, Vishnu is no more to be seen. Hasandi, sometimes he smiles, he is deeply contented, and sometimes he dances. You can find such interesting things happening in Sri Ramakrishna's life. Maybe the most striking example of what happens to a person who is feeling the presence of God, who is experiencing the reality of God, in everything and every moment in his life, we can see this happening in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. Before that, there is an ascent. Even the highest spiritual persons, even incarnations, have to go through this process of disciplines. But once they reach the stage, the religion actually becomes a reality. That's only occasion when, in the true sense of the term, God becomes a physical reality. Before that, we believe it's an intellectual reality, it is an idea, it's a concept that we believe in, we are sincerely trying to practice, and we know it's a fact. But it becomes an actual reality, a physical reality, only when that veil is removed. And then what happens? is explained in this well-known verse, where the great sage Suga describes the demeanor of a great spiritual person who is feeling the presence of God every minute, in everything and everywhere. Sometimes he cries, thinking of the separation from God. Sometimes he smiles, he laughs. Sometimes he dances. So you can find his demeanor, his behavior transcend conventions, customs and normal practices. It becomes kind of spiritually surcharged state of life and mind. That's what happens. So Bhagavata Purana is very, very universal. Well, before I conclude, I would tell you, those of you who are interested, you can see you can see a similar situation that happens to the character in the Way of a Pilgrim. You know the story of the Way of a Pilgrim, a well-known Russian Christian mystical literature. When he realized the reality of the prayer of Jesus, the pilgrim, in that Way of a Pilgrim, when he actually felt the presence of Jesus, you find he himself felt like a bad universal identity, an inexpressible experience of inner joy and contentment. And many of his statements can be found in a much more graphic style described in the Bhagavata Purana, especially in the Prahlada Upakhyanam, where the great devotee Prahlada's story is narrated. Prahlada was feeling the presence of Krishna everywhere. So that's the state of a super mystic for whom God becomes a reality and not a concept. Thank you. Namaskar. Now we will have interaction. Maybe we have about half an hour. Thank you. Namaskar. You are most welcome to raise subjects for discussion. Thank you.
Okay, and Namaste Maharaj, thank you for the wonderful session. Please raise your hand on the Zoom channel if you have a question. And if you want me to ask the question on your behalf, either on YouTube or on Zoom, you can type it. And if you're on Zoom, we would rather have you ask the question. There is one question, Maharaj. I will let them ask the question. Go ahead, Riya. Please ask the question.
Pranam Maharaj. Maharaj, I have a question. In our everyday life, although we try to keep our minds in the contemplation of our personal deity and into spiritual thoughts with a lot of love, yet we often see that our minds tend to wander downwards into the non-spiritual, mundane thoughts. How will we stop this?
Yeah, that's because our mind is a bundle of conflicting thought currents which can be divided into two categories. One, conducive and friendly and helpful for remembering God. The other, not so very helpful. These are two broad categories. So we have to increase the quantity of positive, helpful samskaras, impressions, by feeding your mind with more and more similar samskaras, similar impressions, healthy samskaras and impressions, by listening, by associating, either by reading, by listening, by thinking, so that as the mind accumulates more and more healthy and friendly samskaras, then the wandering will proportionately decrease and mind becomes more focused. It doesn't happen overnight, but it takes time. But slowly you find mind becomes less disturbed. And secondly, even when the mind is wandering, you should be able to try to detach yourself from that mind. Well, mind is wandering, okay, let me see how far it will wander. If you can actually detach yourself, then mind will wander, but it will start wandering less and less. There is a kind of objectification of our own mind. It's a process. This comes in the Gita, and you can find this explained in a different context by Buddha in his Mahasatyupattana Sutta, which is the origin, the Bible of, so to speak, of mindfulness. It's a Buddha's dialogue, is discourse on Satyupattana. Okay.
There's one more question, Maharaj,
Yeah.
from our friend Bobby. Go ahead, Bobby.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Maharaj.
Yes,
3 days of very valuable and inspiring instruction. My question is, are there traditional ways that spiritual students can offer supports to his or her fellow students?
Yeah. Discussion on some spiritual topics, gathering, discussion on spiritual topics. Actually, it will help us to consolidate our own convictions. And again, as I mentioned, it will feed our mind with spiritual ideas. So normally, devotees, fellow spiritual seekers, congregating together, meeting together, discussing common spiritual topics is a very, very, very traditional way of promoting individual spiritual life and also collective spiritual life. This congregational discussion was very, very common. A congregational chanting, of course, it had many manifestations in today's world. But you can find in the early days when, let us say, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu started, you find. So he used to encourage devotees coming together and discussing and chanting. This is how it all began. In modern times, let us say, devotees coming together and discussing a common topic, either from a scripture or something which of their own interest, which they are interested in, will be one way of supporting each other in spiritual life. And this is it's a very traditional, a very time-honored method of supporting and promoting spiritual life at the individual level and also the collective congregational level.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you.
So the next question, ironically very good, following up on your answer, Maharaj, is from Yoga Narasimha. He's a very good Vedic chanter as well. Go ahead, Veda. As Yoga Narasimha.
Namaskar, this is Mrs. Yoga. Swami ji, Adharaniya Swami ji, aapko bahut thanks. This session was really good. I just have one question. Does meditation help in any way to stay on this path? And if I should meditate, what type of meditation should I practice?
Yeah, meditation is very helpful. So there are two aspects to meditation. Some general ideas can be given, but more focused individual instructions can be given only on an individual basis. So at this stage we can say reading of the scriptures and praying and meditating on some of the great ideas that you get from these holy scriptures, that will help us to generate a lot of spiritual energy, spiritual thought vibrations in our mind. You can, if you have your own traditional way of meditation and rituals, that is also very good, but do that with greater intensity and more frequently. And if you don't have any such normal practices, then reading any of these great scriptures, especially in the Bhagavata Purana, there are many hymns, many great hymns are there. called stutis. A lot of very beautiful, magnificent poetry, very philosophical, very devotional. So some of them are so profound. We can read, if possible, read with the translation and meditate on meaning. So that will help us to go deeper and deeper into the essence of it. So meditation needs some focus at the beginning. So these ideas can create a great focus. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Swamiji.
There is one question from YouTube, Maharaj.
Yeah.
First of all, there is thank you for the wonderful retreat. And the question is, how do we define forbearance and how does one develop it?
How do we develop what?
How do we define forbearance? Forbearance. I don't know if you made that comment there, but maybe the person can join Zoom to ask the question yourself. Forbearance.
Forbearance. Oh yeah, that when we try to focus on some high ideal, you'll be able to forbear. You'll be able to bear worldly problems with greater fortitude. So what we need is a higher ideal, an ideal that is higher than anything related to our worldly actions or worldly intentions or purposes. A high ideal in spiritual life. In our everyday life, if you have a high ideal, that will help us to take in our stride our normal problems and help us to increase our forbearance, power of forbearance.
Trying to see if there are more questions. Questions on Zoom, none on YouTube.
So anyway, thank you for those.
There is one question, Maharaj.
Yeah.
Mark, please go ahead and you can ask your question.
Yeah, please. It's not audible.
No, yeah, he has to unmute. Mark, you're next.
Okay, here I am.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to acknowledge your hard work in presenting these lectures. I've been with you since Friday night, which I think a lot of us have, and I just want to say that I feel very inspired to read more scriptures. And my question is the value of a Satguru or a guru in a seeker's progress in spiritual life.
Yeah, it's very important. A teacher is very important because teacher not only gives you instruction in a very intellectual sense, but also will hand over to you something which is not visible. Instruction is also the ability to practice and live according to that instruction also comes from the teacher. So Sadguru is very important part of spiritual life, and if you do not have right now a teacher, you need not worry about it. You can read any of these holy books with sincerity, and eventually you will get the good fortune to have a teacher. That's how our tradition looks upon it. Tradition believes that you will get when you seek one. But before that, we need not get disappointed. We can read these books seriously and try to live accordingly. Then you develop an inclination to listen to these ideas, and that will slowly, eventually take you to a teacher. Okay.
There's one, Maharaj. Go ahead, David.
Good morning, Swami.
Yeah.
the performance of duty, you noted, is not enough. Duty is sometimes easy to perform. It's sort of like the law, it's mechanical and sort of applying one's mind to it. How, in the process of doing that, can one imbue it with a greater spiritual purpose, other than I'm doing it?
Yeah. You know, spirituality cannot really be defined in words. But if there is one word that can serve the purpose of a definition from a very, very intimate psychological perspective, is contentment. Now, duty doesn't always bring contentment. It brings contentment, yes, for some time. But suppose you have done your best, your obligations, your duty, whatever it is, you normally anticipate a reciprocal reaction from the world or from anyone for whom you have done this duty. But it doesn't happen that way. You know, the logic of 2 plus 2 is 4 doesn't operate in the realm of real life. That's something very interesting we should remember. It doesn't work that way. And it's good that it doesn't work that way, because if that mathematical logic really worked in real life, there will be no human pursuit for higher happiness, anything higher than the empirical pain and pleasure. So what happens is, see, you do your best, but the person for whom you have done your best doesn't look at it that way. He looks at it differently and interprets differently. And you have no control over how he interprets your actions. You have done your best. I'm just giving an example. Any person who has done his best, a lot of self-sacrificing, very honest, sincere, great souls have faced this problem. And actually that's what actually turned them to spirituality. So they start looking for something higher that doesn't belong to this world, because this world and its logic doesn't give a satisfactory explanation of what we are experiencing around, in this life, in our life, or outside. So you need an ideal that goes beyond the empirical definitions or understandings of duty or obligations, which doesn't contradict duty but goes beyond the normally understood definitions of duty. Whether somebody is happy or not, it makes you really happy. That's what you need, such a definition, such a way of performing your duty. A different way of performing our duty is to do our duty in a way that no matter how others feel about it, it brings real contentment to us. Real contentment I'm talking about. The real contentment means lasting contentment, not temporary satisfaction. So that comes from spirituality. Because when you take up a spiritual ideal, you are actually looking for something higher than whatever is available in the empirical phenomenal world. So if you have a sense of duty and this higher ideal in some remote corner of our mind or at some distant horizon, that will not that will help us from feeling bitter or dissatisfied when your duty doesn't produce a reciprocal beneficial reaction from the world. It is not that we neglect the world, we ignore how the world reacts, not at all. We look for something higher. So that higher perspective or ideal is necessary even to do our duty properly and efficiently without feeling hurt by it. Otherwise you find many well-meaning people, many extremely sincere, honest, philanthropists, social workers, people who have done so much to help others. They were not spiritually ready to withstand when an unexpected reaction came from the world that they were trying to serve and help. So, in order to save ourselves from that problem, we need a higher ideal, which doesn't go against the concept of duty, which accommodates it, but goes beyond it.
Okay, Maharaj. There are quite a few questions, which is good. Next, Vaidehi. Go ahead, Anna.
Namaste, Swami. Thank you so much for this retreat.
Yeah.
I have a kindergarten question, and the question from the kindergartner is, what makes a Purana a Purana? Like, why isn't the Bhagavad Gita a Purana?
Not a Purana.
What is Purana?
Yeah.
Your question, what is Purana? Purana means it is ancient, but it contains ideas which are modern and relevant to our times. That's the real literal meaning. Purapi Nava means something that is eternal because it is ancient and it is relevant in ancient times. It is also relevant for our times. So that's the real meaning of Purana. And Bhagavata Purana has a special significance because it is maybe it is the most philosophical of the Puranic literature, which are altogether 36 in number. Of all of them, Bhagavata Purana is supposed to be the most profound and the most philosophical. And your question about kindergarten, you said?
Yes.
Oh, what I meant was, kindergarten is actually the most important, significant part of our education, really speaking, because you begin there, and without a beginning, you cannot have anything. So you have to begin somewhere. So kindergarten, I didn't mean the building or the structure with the official billboard. I didn't mean that. I meant the beginning stage. I'm talking about the beginning stage of anything. So kindergarten is very important, but we should not stop at the beginning. Beginning should be a beginning and should be looked upon as a beginning. So what I meant was, in spiritual life, we may begin. We may begin with external practices, which are external practices are very important because they take our focus our senses away from external sense of to our normal activities, functions.
Sure, thank you so much. And but my other question too is, why is the Bhagavad Gita not considered a Purana? Because to me, that has timeless, right?
Bhagavad Gita is not a Purana. Bhagavad Gita has got a special place in the Vedantic canonical literature. Bhagavad Gita actually is from Mahabharata, which has got the same status as one of the Smritis, one of the secondary scriptures. But because Bhagavad Gita was interpreted by Shankaracharya as a unique classical work incorporating all Vedantic ideas, so every great significant Vedantic concept, philosophical concept found in the Vedas will find a place in Shankaracharya's interpretation of Bhagavad Gita. Historically, Bhagavad Gita was not at all known or read or well known to the public before Shankaracharya wrote a commentary on it. Because we have many Gitas. Even in the Mahabharata itself, there are many Gitas, Vyadha Gita, Uttara Gita, and there are many, and also Bhagavata Purana also has got Gita, Uddhava Gita, etc. Uttara Gita is in Mahabharata, Uddhava Gita is in Bhagavata Purana. Please don't confuse with each other. Uttara means later, the next one, to the end. So, you find there are many Gitas, But Shankaracharya wrote a unique commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, incorporating all the most profound Vedantic ideas, Vedic ideas and concepts into it. So Bhagavad Gita became so well known and a world spiritual classic. The only reason is Shankaracharya wrote a commentary on it. That is something very surprising. So Bhagavad Gita is not a Purana. It is from Mahabharata. And it is only a small, tiny fragment of Mahabharata, which has got more than 100,000 verses. So Bhagavad Gita, literally if you do not think of Shankara's commentary, we don't know what Bhagavad Gita would have what role it would have played in the history of Hinduism. Even the meaning that we attach to Bhagavad Gita, even those who disagree with Shankaracharya's interpretation have to take a clue from Shankaracharya's own interpretation to make sense of what Bhagavad Gita actually says. So also Upanishads. So please remember, it is not a Purana, it is Samasta Vedata Sara Sangraha Bhudam Durvikeyatam. Shankaracharya says it is a condensed, summarized gist of all the most profound Vedic, Vedantic ideas. It is the digest, the summarized form or the summary of all the most profound spiritual and philosophical ideas of Vedic tradition. That is what Bhagavad Gita is. Okay.
Raj, do you have time for 3 more questions?
Is there time? Is there? I think we have 5 minutes more. Okay. Most welcome.
Go ahead, Kirit. Please ask the question.
Yeah.
Pranam Guruji, my question was why some of the Gyan Panthi or Gyan Margis don't believe in Bhakti Yoga.
Oh yeah. Okay, now first of all it is wrong, what you said is wrong, because the greatest exponent of Jnana was Advaita Acharya Shankaracharya himself. In his commentary on the Gita, there is a verse, Maicha Ananya Yogena Bhaktira Vibhijarini Vivikta Desha Sevittum Anabhirjana Samsadi. This is a verse I should translate. It comes sometime maybe 13th chapter, 10th or 11th verse. There are 1 or 2 versions. Now, you know what it means. What is the most profound bhakti, pure bhakti, that is discussed in this verse? And Shankaracharya says in this commentary that bhakti ajnanam, the path of devotion and the path of knowledge, are 2 different paths only for those who are still evolving, progressing, not for those who have attained the goal. So Shankaracharya defines in his commentary on this particular verse, remember, Maicha Ananya Yogena Bhakti Abhibhijarini. Abhibhijarini Bhakti, what is the most unwavering, the most steadfast, focused devotion. That is the subject of discussion here. He says, Shuddha, Nirmala, Na Vibhijarana Shila, Vibhijarini, etc. He says, this devotion, which is unwavering, which is pure, which is steadfast. And then he says, Sacha Jnanam, that devotion itself is the path of knowledge. So he equates the path of devotion and the path of knowledge as equally significant, as equal to each other, at the highest point of realization. When you reach the goal, when you look down, you find both bhakti and jnanam are equally real, equally significant. There may be exponents who claim to be followers of Shankaracharya and who may boast of being exclusively jnanis. They may contain bhakti. For that, Acharya Shankara is not responsible, because Acharya Shankara is the original exponent of Advaita Siddhanta, the path of knowledge, as a integrated combat philosophical system by writing commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, on the Upanishads and Brahma Sutra Prasthanatraya. Please remember. And not only that, the greatest of Advaita Acharya wrote the most profound, the most moving devotional poetry in Sanskrit, 65. Can you name one devotional poem written by either Madhva Acharya or Ramanujacharya that can be compared to Shankaracharya's devotional poems? No. Each one of the 65 devotional poems written by Shankaracharya are so profound, something that did not come from any of the teachers of bhakti. The greatest poems of bhakti came from the greatest teacher of Advaita Jnanam, not from Bhakti Acharya. Can you just name one poem that can be compared to Ananda Lahari, Shivananda Lahari, Bhavani Ashtagam, Gadistum Tomega Bhavani, Vishnu Shakpati? Shankaracharya, in the most profound devotional poem on Vishnu is Shankaracharya's poem. The most profound devotional poem on Shiva is written by Shankaracharya. The most profound devotional poem written on Divine Mother is Shankaracharya. So, but how can you say that Advaitins are against bhakti? The greatest bhaktas are the greatest Advaitins. That's the reality. Because they look upon everything as an expression of the divine. Okay, thank you.
One question from Bhagavata.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Pranam Maharaj. So I have a question. So it says that Brahman cannot be expressed using speech.
Yeah.
But we find expressions like Brahman is a witness.
Yeah, yeah.
And Brahman is this and Brahman is that.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile these?
Yeah. Very good, very good. See, very philosophical question. Anyway, now in the bhashyas, in the Upanishad literature itself, you find every statement about Brahman is only an effort to define what cannot be defined. That's very interesting. Brahma Satyam Jagad Mithya, etc. Aham Brahmasmi Mahavakya, you find these are only approximations, not equal, not definitions. So the real experience of Brahmajnanam goes beyond any statement about Brahmajnanam. Remember, the real experience of Brahmajnanam, knowledge of Brahman, transcends all possible definitions and statements about Brahman. That's very important. In fact, this is what Shankaracharya writes in the Sutra Bhashya at the end of Chatusutri. Even Aham Brahmasmi itself doesn't it is not the complete statement. The highest experience is, the inner real feeling, being and becoming one with this universal spiritual reality. And that experience it is far beyond any definition, any statement, any verbalization. But then when in the world, when we discuss spirituality, even God, let's say we say Krishna as God, God has this form, God has these characteristics, Lord Krishna or Shiva, or you go on defining. But we are only trying to explain what cannot be explained. This is a common principle to be understood. A book or word or a number of words together do not constitute the reality. The reality is beyond books and words. The reality cannot be confined within the framework of any book or any statement. But spiritual seekers, they need to sit and discuss, because they have to practice spiritual disciplines. They have to purify their mind. For that, they have to read the scriptures. Do you think that Bhagavata Purana limits Lord Krishna to this? No. But we read Bhagavata Purana and we equate Bhagavata to Krishna. Why? Because this book reminds you of the spiritual teachings of Lord Krishna. So it has a significance, it has a spiritual significance. So we discuss. Like that, Vedanta ideas also we discuss. It is for our good, it is not to define God. It is for our spiritual discipline that we discuss Brahman, we discuss spiritual values, etc. It is not for defining Brahman, but to fill our mind with pure thoughts, pure ideas, pure vibrations. That is the purpose of all discussions.
I think there is one last question which might be very relevant to the whole Labor Day retreat.
Yeah.
This is from YouTube by Tattwamayananda Mukherjee. First thanking you for a wonderful retreat. The question is, could you please explain the Shanta form of bhakti in some detail?
Yeah, the great rishis, the great sages in ancient times, they practiced the Shanta Bhava. They were all, but they looked upon God as maybe the child or somebody whom they should look after. So that is one kind of one way of discipline. You can practice anything. You can practice Dhasya Bhava, Sakya Bhava, any of these disciplines can be practiced. But the great sages in ancient times, they used to look upon Vishnu. This mostly you find the Vaishnava tradition. They used to practice this bhava, looking upon Krishna or Vishnu as a child to be protected. I mean, some kind of intimacy to be developed. For that, normal human relations, normal human associations or imaginations, emotions are sublimated to a spiritual focus. So the great sages used to practice this. You can find this in some of the instructions, some of the discussions in Vasishtas, Parashara, some Vishwamitra, some of their statements in the Mahabharata and Bhagavata and other Puranas. You find such statements where they looked upon Krishna as little child. So that affection, the paternal affection they felt for, that human relationship is given a spiritual orientation. But you don't find that recommended for modern times. It was something that the ancient sages used to practice.
Okay, Maharaj, that is the last question, and there are so many other comments. On behalf of all the attendees, I want to pass on the gratitude that all the attendees have expressed for this wonderful 3 days of lecture.
Yeah.
So I convey that on their behalf. Thank you so much, Maharaj, and then we can close the program.
Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank
So
you.
please visit vedanta.org. You can sign up to our email list to be notified of future events and lectures. There will always be lectures every week. Please kindly join the mailing list. Thank you and have a wonderful day.